Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We are talking national political news of the day. We are on the day after Super Tuesday, normally a very exciting primary time for the presidential race. Wasn't very exciting yesterday for the presidential race, but there are also, we're talking about 15 states and one territory. And so a lot of stuff happened across the country. We'll try to discuss as much as we can in the next, 12 minutes or so. But but one thing that happened, Trump won all but one of his contests. Biden won all but one of his contests. Trump lost, curiously enough, against the polls to Nikki Haley in Vermont, but won everywhere else. There are some concerns that Karl Rove and other Republicans have raised, though, about some of the numbers in some of the states, and whether or not they can win all of the Nikki Haley voters. We'll talk about that. Well, Joe Biden lost in the American Samoa. It is a caucus system, a kind of a very intricate caucus system. Bloomberg won it 4 years ago. An entrepreneur named Palmer won it today. So somebody who's running for president in a very long shot deal managed to slip in and get a bunch of people to show up to caucuses that people don't normally show up to. So it really doesn't signify much. But hey, he's going to have a few delegates at the convention this summer, so it means something. So that's what happened on the presidential level. Nikki Haley this morning officially dropped out of the race, and of note, of course, what made it into all the headlines was she did not endorse Donald Trump, quoting Margaret Thatcher about thinking for yourself. And although Mitch McConnell on his way out did endorse Donald Trump, and it does seem like the Republicans are rounding the wagons around Trump, and so it is a Biden-Trump rematch. We can get into some of the other races that are around the country, but I want to note a couple of real key ones because obviously the big issue is the House and the Senate as well. The Representative Allred overwhelmingly won the Democratic nomination in Texas. He's considered a moderate on gun issues, and he is been running neck and neck with Ted Cruz in the polls so far. And Ted Cruz is now all of a sudden being seen as potentially vulnerable. And apparently Democratic Party donors are thinking of pouring a bunch of money into that race. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, maybe Texas has opened up as a potential win for Democrats, which changes the whole dynamics, because up until now, it was Democrats defending everywhere. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because there is an Emerson College poll. Emerson College tends to, they're not biased conservative, but their methodology tends to have their polls trend more towards Republicans. When the final results happen, Democrats tend to outperform their polls more than other pollsters, but they are a good pollster. They've got Trump winning in Montana by 21%. Not a big surprise. I'm actually kind of surprised it's that close, but the same exact polling sample has Tester ahead of his opponent Cheney, the Republican, by 2 points. So you've got a lot of Trump voters voting for Tester. I've got a couple theories about that, but also John Tester, they keep writing his political epitaph along with Sherrod Brown. And so, but all of a sudden, Tester doesn't necessarily have to win for the Democrats to hold serve. So, we've got, and again, we'll see if the polls coming out in the coming weeks and months as to whether or not these polls in Texas are a fluke. But Ted Cruz may he really did lose a lot of popularity with that trip to Mexico that he blamed on his daughter, right, during the snowstorm. So a lot going on. I want to get into some discussions of the House. There was some good news for Democrats in some of the House races in Southern California. They appeared to be on their way to pick up a seat in Alabama because there are now 2 Black majority districts. History being made there, and a few other reasons for them to be encouraged. But Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Eric, for that setup. You did put an awful lot on the table here for us to talk about. So I guess we might make sense to begin speaking about the presidential returns, even though it was to a certain extent anticlimactic and expected. There are a couple storylines that I think are worth mentioning. And one, of course, is that what was expected did happen. We got, Biden, who's effectively running unopposed with minimal challengers in Dean and Williamson, and also that protest vote of the undecided or undeclared. Biden, he did poorly versus expectation of the protest vote, so to speak, in several places, but in particular, like say Minnesota, where young people, people of color, the exit polling, we didn't scrutinize it too closely, but there's a general malaise, I think, in the party about the, Israeli ethnic, collective punishment, the U.S. support of that. So there is an outlet of dissent. Depending on where you look, it's could be considered marginal, but at the same time, in a lot of these states, it comes down to those margins. So, for example, some states were 3% or less, and they're called battleground states, and some of the battleground states like Michigan did in fact have a significant protest vote. So that thread, we'll see where that goes. I think I mentioned it last night when we were doing the live election returns that you were already starting to see the White House pivot, put Vice President Kamala Harris out there and calling for an immediate ceasefire. And that's a very big difference from where the White House stood just a few weeks ago. So we are seeing, to a certain extent, Democratic responsiveness to that protest. So that's one lane worth commenting on. And another one is, like you said, Nikki Haley did announce today that she was going to suspend her campaign. That was going to be my prediction, actually, because there was coverage yesterday leading into the contests, Super Tuesday, 15 states, that she had no scheduled appointments, no scheduled ad buys, no scheduled travel after yesterday. So it sort of was baked into the cake that if you continuously perform at around a 25% level, give or take, that while she did collect some delegates and she sort of earned people's respect as standing up by, arguably, to Donald Trump. It took a little while, but she really did start letting the elbows fly in recent weeks. So that protest vote was galvanized, but unfortunately, it was, well, I say unfortunately for her benefit, for her sake, she was not gaining ground. And in fact, as the sort of pundits were predicting, Trump is on track to lock it up enough delegates within 2 weeks. So that both of those sort of met expectation, but it's worth noting that we have free will and contingent events. You never know what's going to happen. So the pulse was about right when it came to the presidential nomination. We could pivot from there as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but I don't think there's too much more to tell. Again, there's weaknesses that both candidates have to worry about, but we'll have plenty of time to discuss that. Why don't we get into some of the other races?
Yeah, sure. So there were some notable, again, sometimes predictable, but notable outcomes nonetheless. So, like, for example, in North Carolina, which is a critical state, when you look at the map of, control of the Senate, or when you look at the map of the Electoral College for the presidential race, North Carolina, although it's not being considered one of the battleground states, I don't believe it's actually really a significant battleground state regardless. And that is an incredible outcome there when you have the Republican candidate, he's like an outright, blatant, controversial figure. And so he did win, as predicted. I mean, the big issue I think there is that he's trying to out MAGA everybody basically, um, provocative things. So it's Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, trunk-backed figure. He said things, anti-Semitic, anti-LGBT, Q plus. He said he would support a heartbeat law that it would be murder for anybody killing something with
Sure.
a person basically. So that's a controversial figure that may in fact alienate some voters in that state and sort of have the inverse effect. Attorney General Josh Stein, I think, also won from the Democratic side. That was predictable, but it could help set the tone for the general, where we have more extreme figures. And again, we'll talk more about some of the other. You mentioned Texas. I think Texas is squaring up as one of those places where, although I find it hard to believe Cruz will lose, it's still it's rare that we could contemplate that it would even be close, and polling looks close. So the temperature, the tone across the country is it's going to be a historic year ultimately.
And let me also mention that Biden is behind Trump in Texas, but by less than 5% in every poll so far. He's doing worse in the Midwest than he is in Texas. I'm wondering if some of the goofy stuff happening in Texas is starting to catch up with the Republicans, but we won't know for a while, and then we'll see if that changes. But it's not just one poll; it's poll after poll.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head there, actually. So that's kind of what I was going to mention too. Even though it's a Senate race, I just alluded to, and that you briefed us on with Allred squaring up as the Democratic challenger there. They've had some infighting between traditional, more conservative, so to speak, old school establishment conservatives. There you go, versus sort of the more Trump style conservatives, or they're not necessarily conservative, Trump style Republicans. And there's a little bit of a civil war going on there, where there was an impeachment against the lieutenant governor, and then now there's like battle lines being drawn where the governor is supporting one slate of people, and there's another slate that they're trying to out extreme each other, and that might actually be a net negative for in the closer races that are there, both in the House and possibly even the Senate, although I find it that's a stretch, but we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, again, it's early. And sometimes early on, people try to send messages in polls when they're not happy with somebody. So we'll see. But again, some of the Democratic Party donors are looking at it and talking about putting money into it. Now, just because you put money into something doesn't necessarily mean you think you're going to win. You put money into something and you force the other party to put even more money in to lock it up. There's strategies around that. It's kind of silly, although I'm starting to question how much impact money is even having in election campaigns anymore. There's been some articles out talking about how people with less money have actually been winning more elections than ever. I think it has to do with you used to buy television advertisements, but who watches television anymore, right? So internet ads are not that expensive. Just ask Rusty Hicks, who had YouTube ads up the wall. I don't think he had that much money. He had a lot, but anyway. So we have that happening. But anyway, we'll see. We'll see what happens. But it's just all of a sudden it's on the table as a possibility. The other place where elections are, where the polls are close, I don't want to get distracted in it, is Scott in Florida. Again, within 5 points. But Florida has always been like, Lucy pulling the football on Charlie Brown for Democrats. The polls get close, and then as it gets close to the election, they pull away. So I wouldn't take that one very seriously. But the pickup in Texas, we've been talking about how Texas is trending more blue and will flip sooner or later. Sometimes people thought it was sooner, and then we started saying probably it's going to be later. But people are moving there from California and other places. Who knows? Anyway, I don't want to get too caught up on that. We can talk about also our own Senate race. It's going to be Adam Schiff and the lefty Steve Garden. And by lefty, I mean first baseman who, had a baseball glove on his right hand. He won a spot. He's in, I believe, first place currently, but I am going to predict that Adam Schiff will pass him. It's going to have something to do with my prediction at the end of the show. That's going to be a bit broader than that. But he possibly won because Adam Schiff actually spent time putting ads in conservative areas of the state to boost Garvey so that he would come out ahead of Porter. Katie Porter tried to counter by spending money to boost the next Republican underneath. It didn't pay off. Steve Garvey was a baseball hero. I mean, that infield in the 1970s for the Dodgers was incredible, and older people are going to remember that. And so he did fairly well. Didn't matter that in the debates he didn't know what he was doing. We all know he's probably going to be crushed in November. So Schiff played it well.
Yeah, I know we're in our final minute or so here, but just for California perspective statewide, as we've talked about a lot, that about 2 out of 3 voters are Democratic, about 1 out of 3 are Republican, but that's statewide. It's really a coastal. It's a the map is the coast is mostly Democratic, inland is mostly Republican. So it did play out where money and influence from the establishment, Democratic Party was able to get the outcome that they desired ultimately, and the 2 progressive candidates were marginalized largely successfully from that perspective for Schiff, and so that's the tone, I think, of our state writ large, that the Democratic Party has some divisiveness, but in the end the establishment is successful at meeting its goals.
What about the idea that we should think about democracy, think about the right of the people to elect candidates of their choice, of letting the people decide?
I think that the question that you have to confront is why a single state should decide who gets to be president of the United States.
It just doesn't seem like a state call.
For an insurrection, there needs to be an organized, concerted effort to overthrow the government of the United States through violence. And this
so your point is that a chaotic effort to overthrow the government is not an insurrection?
No, we didn't concede that it's an effort to overthrow the government either, Justice Jackson. Right? None of these criteria were met. This was a riot. It was not an insurrection. The events were shameful, criminal, violent, all of those things, but it did not qualify as insurrection as that term is used in Section 3.
Okay, the Supreme Court decided unanimously, not just the conservatives on the Supreme Court, but all 9 justices decided unanimously that Donald Trump should be allowed to, well, if he qualifies, otherwise should be allowed to be on the ballot on all 50 states. Colorado had, of course, held a trial and determined that in violation of the 14th Amendment, that Donald Trump had incited and participated in an insurrection within the meaning of the 14th Amendment's insurrection clause. Subsequent to that, Maine reached a similar decision, and then very much more recently, Illinois Secretary of State reached a similar decision. They've all been now overturned. Maybe not officially the other 2 states yet, but it's in the works. And we knew this a few weeks ago when the Supreme Court justices, when even the liberals were asking the advocates for the state of Colorado, are you saying that he can be qualify in one state and not another based upon the individual laws of each state? And so to be perfectly clear, the Supreme Court did not rule that he did not commit insurrection. What the Supreme Court ruled, they never even got to that discussion. The Supreme Court ruled that a state alone does not have the jurisdiction to remove them from their own ballot based upon the insurrections clause. Then there was some division in the court. The court went on to exceed its boundaries and basically tell Congress that it can't arbitrarily deny well, not necessarily even the access to the ballot, but also the electoral college votes on whenever the counting happens. And the three liberal justices and Amy Coney Barrett, notably all four women on the Supreme Court, they dissented from that part of the opinion, concurred with the general opinion, saying this is an overreach. Putting limits on what Congress can do was not raised in this. Congress was not even a party to this case. I mean, modern politics is breeding a strange variety of conservatives that feel like they can just, rule from the bench on issues that weren't even raised in the briefing, let alone, a party to it. And this is really, the concurrence was really indignant about it. So again, there have been some political writers who have said conservatism as a political movement is dead. The right wing is now radicalism, not conservatism, including on the Supreme Court. And a lot of people are surprised that Roberts went along with this. A lot of scholars are baffled. And of course, Lawrence Tribe is baffled that the liberals went along with this. He's somebody who a lot of scholars and even justices have thought should have been on the Supreme Court a long time ago, but he's too old because they, anytime anybody appoints somebody now, they want them to be on for decades. It's just the way things are working. So anyway, big deal. Trump at first tried to make it in, to express unity, but then went on and started talking about, and he and his advocates talked about how this is Biden. Biden is behind all of these prosecutions, and should talk about it. And even the Republican advocates on NPR this morning were talking about, yes, what it shows is he should try to win this in the ballot box and not in the courtroom, and as if Biden can go to the judges in New York, Washington, D.C., Florida, and Georgia and say, hey, knock it off, dismiss the cases. Like, he's got that kind of power, again, a new type of conservative, believing the president has the right and power to do that and should do that. I mean, that's really the implication of what they're saying. And meanwhile, the Menendez is being prosecuted, right? Hunter Biden is being prosecuted. But, so if he's got total control over the Department of Justice that's leading to these prosecutions, where does his control begin and where does it end? So this is where we're at. We've got the immunity hearing coming up, and the Supreme Court dragging its feet to get to it, as we've discussed previously. Dave?
Yeah, thank you for that comprehensive setup. Again, several threads here. One of the things that you said, I just want to sort of underline. It was very subtle the way you said it, but just for context and to reinforce it, typically the Supreme Court will have a ruling that addresses the specific issue that's in front of them only, and will intentionally not write an overbroad finding on overbroad, because they're not in the policy creation or policy steering business, particularly conservative, strict constructionist. They're not out there granting people rights under the penumbra of the 14th, 15th Amendments post-Civil War. In fact, they're typically more restrained on every level. But obviously, as you mentioned, that's not this court. This court is attempting and actually becoming transformative in many ways. And so in this instance, when we're talking about what guidelines that states ought to follow when trying to help enforce the the insurrection clause. What should they be doing? You and I talked about this once before, that Justice Kavanaugh actually wrote about this when he, in a law journal article many years ago, where it was his position that it needs a structure that, although it hadn't really been followed much since the post-Civil War era, that in order to be relevant, it needs structure. Because Congress back then, I think, granted immunity basically, and just said, it in effect mooted the there was some restrictions, exclusions that were beginning to happen.
There were restrictions, and states actually did. This actually overturns a bunch of state actions that were taken during the Reconstruction era. But you're right, Congress kind of gave a lot of them the free pass.
Yeah. So now my point here was that Kavanaugh has his theory, his philosophy, his legal philosophy, I think what encouraged him to make the case that, hey, look, Congress needs to act. And apparently that was convincing to his colleagues there, including Justice Roberts, so that they did choose to overreach and write a more broad ruling here. But I think, like you mentioned, the fact that Amy Coney Barrett was not convinced, and she just said, she called it out as not being conservative, and in fact overreaching. I'm not going to say anything negative about her, but to be honest, I think that she's correct here in making that observation. But secondarily, so a second subtle piece of what you had said at the end of what you were talking about was how, well, the Supreme Court did agree to take up the immunity question, but they put it on the calendar 2 months out, the end of April.
Right.
So that's an overtly political act. If they chose to, they could have fast-tracked this when it first was brought to the table. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And they have the capacity to do it. Maybe they could say, hey, we're not going to do the Democrats any favors. But at this point, it's a little different. They're actually saying, oh, in fact, we're going to put this, we're going to push this out a couple months, which in effect, I think makes it nearly impossible for Trump's legal issues to have influence on the election other than headlines and the press, and if people internalize it. But some recent polling has showed that, only around half of people really pay attention anymore to Trump's legal issues, and they don't really follow it. It doesn't influence them. They already have an opinion about it. And so, it's either you know him and you accept it, or you know him and you don't accept it. So by taking it off the table, that would have been some degree, that would have introduced the capacity for a game-changing new headline or a new influence. This is a leveling of the playing field that, like I said, I think it will be historically considered as an overtly political act.
Yeah. I don't think they're going to grant immunity. I do think they're just dragging things out. What they might be underestimating, and where Trump's lawyers may have miscalculated, is what does that ruling say? Because he will have suffered another defeat in court at that point. He's not immune. Oh, really? Okay. So it's just, it can go any way. You don't know how things are going to go. I don't think anything's going to affect the MAGA supporters, but I've seen it locally here. Now, we saw a local judge's race. I don't want to get into the weeds of that. But people I talked to said, well, that the timing of that is suspicious, and you shouldn't weaponize the procedures. And I put it to the people telling me this: how did they weaponize it? Give me the mechanism. How did this happen? And they just kind of stare at me like those questions are irrelevant. I mean, it is political. Most people believe it was a political decision. They won't say how. They won't say, did Biden actually order the DOJ to do this stuff? Order Fani Willis to do it in Georgia? I mean, and does he have control over the courts, the lower court? I mean, it just is ridiculous. But that's where people want to go, because right now they're not happy with Biden because they're paying a lot in groceries and whatever other reason. And the left isn't happy with him because of the situation in the Middle East. And so it's the way the human mind works. You look for reasons to disregard things. It's really not tricky. I've been studying this. A mind does not necessarily react to evidence that contradicts what it wants to believe. It's just, it takes a lot. It takes a long time. And you have to be taught how to do that. And so this is what Biden is up against. And I'm not saying he can't do it. I do think that, as we get closer to the election, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, seriously, do I want to vote for Trump? But right now, they're sending messages in the polls, and this win with the Supreme Court did bolster his campaign, at least for the moment.
Yeah, definitely, and I think also it's a corollary to what I pointed out about the it being an overtly political act, and so maybe it's not an orchestrated, it's not a conspiracy, it's not. There's no like Trump didn't do this. It's self-interested justices following their own judicial philosophy and trying not to interject their political temperament or distemperament, right? Like I'm not throwing shade on them in any way, but the truth is that when given the nature of our Congress, given the power division, that we realize that the filibuster is just so often enacted, or the threat of a filibuster, it prevents most things from moving forward if there's a dedicated group that has less than 60 votes, which is nowadays that's the norm in the Senate. So in effect, by saying that Congress has to pass a law to make it so that the Constitution itself and in the clause, the insurrection clause, they're basically saying the insurrection clause is not enforceable, because you're saying, well, only if Congress acts, and knowing that they're not. So again, that's maybe it's three-dimensional chess, and maybe it's a little bit of projection, but in reality, that's the impact.
I hear you there, and I want to get back to Amy Coney Barrett again, because she has expressed concern in the past about the fact that the Supreme Court is being perceived as a partisan organization, and she is upset about that. She's gone to universities and said, no, it's not. And so it may be that that's part, her impetus. She's had people kind of almost protest her, saying, yes, it is. And I'm wondering if she's kind of heard that and is a little bit conscious about that, and that's why she's parted ways with the men or her male colleagues on this.
Yeah, and I think we are a political show, the two of us here, and so that's in part why we're thinking through these political implications. But the truth is that if you just put your ear to the street, so to speak, and you talk to your colleagues and your friends and family and peers, and you just listen to what people are saying, people are relatively there's a lot of clarity involved when they say, oh, look what the Supreme Court did. They put their finger on the scale. So even if it's, again, even if it's not that way, the perception is there. And so that's like to your point about Amy Coney Barrett saying, oh, well, we are being accused of politicization, but it's really not the case. Well, one could argue that, on the merits, if you look at how these cases have been handed down, that you're not doing yourself any favors in this instance.
In 2017, I warned we were approaching a crossroads. Our democracy was weakened by government dysfunction and the constant pull to the extremes by both political parties. I promised I would do my best to fix it, to protect and defend our Constitution, to listen to others without judging, to focus on what unites us, and to make Americans' lives better. Through listening, understanding, and compromise, we delivered tangible results that make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. Yet, despite modernizing our infrastructure, ensuring clean water, delivering good jobs and safer communities, Americans still choose to retreat farther to their partisan corners.
Okay, speaking of the filibuster, a development happened which may actually, if the Democrats manage to hold the Senate, could lead to the end of the filibuster. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But Sinema, we've talked about Cinemansion. Senator Sinema is out. She is leaving the Senate, I'm not quite sure what impact it's going to have on the race in Arizona, which is between Gallego and Lake at this point. There was a lot of debate about who she would draw more from, but she is not. She had decided to go independent, even though she was still caucusing with the Democrats, and she has decided she's had enough. She's out, so. That leaves a little bit of a vacuum, and it's a close race according to the polls between Gallego and Lake. Lake has been defeated in her attempts at statewide office so far, but and she is considered a full-on Trumper. And Gallego is considered, well, more liberal than Sinema, or even her senior, who would be his senior person, Mark. Why am I forgetting his last name? The other senator, Democratic senator in Arizona.
Mark Kelly.
Thank you, Mark Kelly. He's considered a little bit more centrist. Paul Gallegos is a liberal, but he also has real solid backing from the Latino community. So he's got. This is going to be an interesting race, but talking about Kirsten Sinema, I mean, she's out. Maybe she'll get some cushy lobbyist job or whatever. But, I want to talk a little bit about her because, she'll probably, the story she'll tell is, well, I was out because I'm a moderate who wanted to be bipartisan in an era when bipartisanship is frowned upon. There are moderates who want to have bipartisanship, who are surviving, who are continuing to function. She and Manchin are both out. Of course, Manchin is in like the reddest state in the country. It was a miracle that he was even in there. And he didn't play it right. If he was going to stay in, he needed to really stick with the unions and not stick it to them. Maybe play conservative on some social issues. But Sinema, I mean, she was originally a Green Party member, right? She had progressive bona fides, and she could have moderated a bit, but she offered nothing. When she decided she was going to be more centrist, it wasn't even like she had a philosophy that she articulated. When she was taking these positions and blocking what the Democrats were doing, she didn't engage. She didn't have discussions. She avoided the press. She avoided her constituents. And said, and instead showed up to lavish fundraisers back at home at a spa, while Democrats back in Washington were, scrambling to come up with some type of compromise that she wouldn't basically veto. She and Manchin, when they were trying to pass these very visionary acts that were supposed to be the cornerstone of the Biden administration. And ideologically, she just seemed to be representing the oil industry and other interests. She didn't engage, and so it's her. And she and Manchin would show up to meetings, and Democrats would be coming up. Well, maybe we could do this, maybe we could do that, and both of them would just sit there silent, not offer anything. It was just basically their way or the highway. Well, even today, that's just not politically sustainable. If you want to wheel and deal and be the compromised politician or something, you got to do it. You got to offer something. You can't just sit there and not do it because somebody who is paying your, for your campaign, putting money in, says we don't want any of that. She is the reason for her own demise. She went too extreme in her quote unquote moderation. It wasn't moderation. It was stubborn extremity with no interaction, and her constituency was her funders, and that was it.
Yeah, we could probably put a ribbon on it there because that was pretty tight. But to be honest, there's a little bit more to say. Like you said, she started in the Green Party and then joined the Democratic left and was a sweetheart of
Mhm.
the left, but then molded herself as an iconoclastic centrist independent. But she did. It's like a tale of two cities. She was involved in helping Biden administration pass COVID relief and the
Yeah,
infrastructure legislation. So those are that the massive stimulus to the country. Some people are critical of the inflationary impact, but the reality of it is the country was in an emergency situation, and that not only do you patch the emergency, dig out the cavity, but you put the filling in too, right? So that's what she was able to contribute towards in her to her credit. But she was one of those people that, like you said, she actually stopped meeting with her constituents and people who were disgruntled by her choices, and it's a sort of an open secret, I guess, that's been published everywhere. So it's not like we're defaming her in any way. That
right.
she was very, very responsive to Wall Street and to the pharmaceutical industry, and you mentioned big oil. I didn't recall big oil, but the others kind of speak for themselves. And all along, people were saying, "Oh, she obviously doesn't care about getting reelected. She's obviously in queue for some." Lobbying role or some other cush position. And unfortunately, the cynics appear to have been right. But beyond that, I think she saw the writing on the wall. If she somehow was successful in terms of polling and having prospects for getting reelected, maybe she would have hung in there a little bit longer. But she was running third in a three-way race with no
Yeah,
prospects, and
in the teens, down in the teens with
yeah. So really, she didn't have a path anymore, and this was self-preservation, likely. And so, why is that important? I think because this state is one of the battleground states. It's in effect, these 5 to 7 states, depending on how you cut it, are going to be where the presidential elections decided, and also ultimately the balance of power, because it's a senatorial race after all. When you before we got into this call, I played out on 270 to win, just what the balance in the Senate might look like on the map, where you can select leans
sure.
left, leans right. And this one, it was defaulted for some reason for me to leaning Republican, but when I just switch it back to lean Democrat just to see where it plays out, that's a 50-50 split Senate. So it really is indicative of how important each of these battleground states are going to be. So while her dropping out is really important, it's an unknown, as you said. It's an unknown as of now about how her support is going to split between the parties.
As I sort of hinted at the beginning, the reason the filibuster is still in place and is largely because the Democrats talked about, if not undoing it altogether, at least carving out. They already have exceptions for getting judges through for civil rights. If you're not going to be the party that stands for civil rights, then what are you? If you're the Democrats, and they wanted to save the Voting Rights Act. They wanted to restore a bunch of aspects of civil rights, and
the John Lewis bill. The John Lewis bill would have been historic.
Right. Yeah, and Manchin and Sinema both said, "Oh, we support the bill, but we just don't support watering down the filibuster." And they talk about the filibuster like it's a constitutional provision. It's not. It's nowhere in the Constitution. It's not. It is it's actually a very undemocratic thing. I mean, we've all saw Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and quite frankly, if that's what the filibuster was, I would support it, right? One person having to speak. I'd even support it if you can turn it over to other people, and you got to carry on and be speaking, and we're having a national dialogue about it. But you can filibuster by email now. That's just way too easy. And so but they were just both. Sinema Manchin was intransigent about it. No, we're not going to do that. And it was the rest of the Democrats, including people like Tester and other moderates who do face these tough reelections, did support it. Now, I've wondered if people like Tester, did that because they had the cover of Cinemansion. And if all of a sudden it was up to them, would they have a lot of pressure on them, and would they take that role? We'll see. I don't think Tester would, but others like him in that situation. Tester has been able to present himself as the feisty farmer, old agrarian populist kind of guy who can put up a fight, and he can afford to take some progressive stands in the old tradition. He's managed to sell himself that way. But but anyways, I mean, we can talk about it a little bit, but it's possible that the filibuster may be either gone or severely or reduced in some way.
And actually, I'm glad you brought this point up because it's a double-edged sword. When people pontificate about the importance of the filibuster from the being what keeps the republic in balance, and our Constitution and our government was designed so that in a federalist system, the states ultimately have in effect the highest levels of authority, autonomy, and influence at the national level, that consent comes from knowing that states had this power in the Senate. In fact, there was, like you said, there was not a filibuster in mind. And if you look at the Federalist Papers, nowhere are they talking about filibusters, right? So,
Yeah.
So then the question is, would it be the demise of the republic if we were to do away with it? People say, well, every time that Republicans win the Senate, then you will see, catastrophic impact. And then when the Democrats take it back, they will undo everything and then do catastrophic impact in their own way. And that we will devolve into
go back and forth.
Yeah. And then that lack of continuity would be that disruption that it would be too destabilizing to our country to warrant that change. But I think that's a little bit of fear mongering, particularly in light of the fact that if you look at what I've called, and I didn't make this up, but it's out there, the democratic deficiency, when we already have baked into the cake that, back in the day, the Senate represented the state legislature. They didn't represent the people. So you had the in effect, our new American, mercantile, aristocratic, landowning elite class, they selected the senators and nobody even got to choose.
Yeah.
So
it was the progressive movement that got it to be a popular vote.
Yeah. So to be honest, if there is a tempering effect from the filibuster, it is anti-democratic, but our system was designed to be anti-democratic. In the Senate.
Right.
In the Senate.
The Senate is like the House of Lords. It's supposed to be the reasonable one, and the rest. It should have been the one that stood up to Trumpism, and in some cases it has, kind of, sort of. But I'm not against the filibuster. I just think it needs to be earned. I think that you need to go back to where you're doing this performative. You have to keep talking. I don't think it has to be one person. I think you should be allowed to hold it off another. But then you've got full coverage by the media and a national discussion where constituents are calling up their people and saying, yes, I support that, or no, I don't support that. And then you get it. The legislatures get a sense of it. Okay, maybe we should change this bill, or no, you guys keep yapping because the people are behind us, right? It's just there could be done, but they don't have to do it. It's done, behind closed doors by an email, and it's not. It's too easy. They've made it too easy. And the rest of it. Let somebody stand up and speak against civil rights for days. See how that goes for them. Right. I mean, it just it just depends on what it is.
And make there be some cost. And I've heard other people express this opinion, and I didn't know that was your opinion too. But it absolutely makes sense to, at the very least, make there be a cost to going down this route each and every time you choose to engage in a filibuster, because what we have now, I guess, not everybody really knows this because some people are more inclined to read headlines or whatever, but what we have now is there's a default filibuster in place. You have to prove that you can reach that threshold, which puts no one on the spot. No one is required to actually sound, each and every time that, oh, by the way, we're going to stick together at all costs without, reflection, without contemplation, without deliberation.
Yeah.
And that's in part, I think, why Congress has one of the lowest institutional approval ratings in its history. And also I think it is the lowest in history, but it's also one of the lowest of all institutions in terms of favorability amongst people in our country over many decades. It's at its low point, and it's one of the lowest. And not to compare necessarily, but there are very few institutions with a lower approval than the in effect our do nothing Congress, that they can get together when they have to, and in fact they just did today, but it's the exception as opposed to the rule that people cross party lines and work together.
To be fair, Congress is never popular. It's never going to be. It never has been. Mark Twain, wrote humor plays about Congress, and the rest. But maybe it shouldn't be for it to function right. It's the conglomeration of all the different interests. But again, that's why it should be about the constituents. If your constituents are different, well, anyway, that's where Sinema failed. She abandoned her constituents. It's not her moderation, not her style. Well, her style, yes. But anyway, we have to move on. Well, don't let the door hurt you on your way out, Sinema. Sorry.
Eeny, meeny, chili, beanie. The spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
That brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
Well, as I just alluded to in our last segment, sometimes Congress can get together and do things. And while I'm not talking about the Senate necessarily, in this case, I'm talking about the House. The House today voted to move forward the funding bill 329 to 85, which means that it was bipartisan. And in fact, the Republican speaker, needed to rely heavily on Democrats to get this moving forward to avoid the government shutting down this weekend. So this is them moving forward with about half of the bills, I think 6 that are in play. But now they have another one they have to pass. And what they've done so far is fund half the government through the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th. And so at what cost, right? So what did they have to do? The Republicans who did go along got small victories, like, for example, they cut the budget of the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and they cut the budget to the FBI, and they cut budget to environmental enforcement programs. So that was the pound of flesh they were able to extract in return for moving this forward. So my prediction is, and they also got earmarks. About $13 billion in earmarks were handed out for people where they can spend money in their constituent projects. So my prediction is that, yes, this will pass the Senate easily. The government won't shut down at the end of the week. And this same thing is going to play out again. So by March 22nd, and probably even earlier, they will do this same exercise again to fully fund the rest of the government through the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah, one of those earmarks was an LGBTQ center in Philadelphia. I don't want to get into it, but it's really sucked. But I'm going to try to be quick here. California, it used to be in California races that absentee votes, the early votes, were conservative. And so the first reports would be very conservative leaning, and then the rural areas always came in first, and then as the night went on election night, the urban areas would come in and things would move more liberal, and you always hope that the liberals would pass at about the 50% mark and get a big enough lead before Orange County, who always somehow hardly got its counting done until the very end, would drop a bomb on and give the win to Reagan or Duke Magian or whatever. I mean, it was the way it worked. Things are much different now since 2020 because of all the politics we've talked about. It's conservatives now vote on election day instead. And so the dynamics are the early vote tends to be progressive. And then as we moved through the night last night, the same day voting, the election day voting, moved things kind of conservative. I'm looking at all of the statewide races and the local races. I am predicting that the conservative trend on all of the races have peaked. And when you look at Proposition 1 to everything to our local judges race, you're going to see a progressive trend with the counting from here on in. Any progressive lead is going to increase, any conservative lead is going to decrease. This is the new dynamic, and it is the explanation for Trump's complaint as to why did I start to lose? And this time I've kind of documented it because I'm going to put it into a kind of essay showing what happened. Anyway. That is all we have for tonight. I will be back talking about that dynamic another time. But until then, stay informed and stay engaged.